Morning team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce. This is the Ukraine War News Update video for the 8th of April 2023. Let's get straight to the opening gambit that I go to every news update video, which is the Russian losses as according to the General Staff of Ukraine for the day before. Usual caveats, inaccurate propaganda. I find these indicatively useful and actually pretty accurate and try and give some evidence to support that. 570 liquidated personnel is higher than yesterday. Still lower than it has been over previous weeks, but we are seeing either a culmination or an effect of the weather, or indeed both, and I would suggest both. A culmination of the Russian forces. I think their offensive has effectively come to an end. They will be piling everything they can into particularly Bakhmut, as they need something out of this offensive, and so the eventual grinding loss of Bakhmut could be their only kind of their token success. And I say success in inverted commas, given the losses they will have taken in doing so, if they do indeed take Bakhmut after 9 months of trying. 570 liquidated personnel, 3 tanks, 4 APCs, so it's not huge. 5 artillery systems, useful. It seems that around Bakhmut, indeed, there's been a number of artillery systems, particularly Nonna mortars. There's been 2 or 3. I've seen video footage of 3, I think, taken out. 2 of them certainly in the Bakhmut area. 1 anti-aircraft warfare system. Again, I keep saying that could be an expensive one, like an S-300, a Burk, or it could be something like an autocannon on the back of either on a APC chassis or back of a truck or whatever. So be careful with interpreting that as always being a big rocket system. 1 aircraft, show you footage of that, or at least footage of an explosion, not the actual downing of it, but apparently it is a Russian aircraft. 7 drones and 12 vehicles and fuel tanks. So pretty kind of average day, but of course 1 aircraft is always a big loss for the Russians in terms of not just the equipment, but the trained personnel involved, either 1 or 2 pilots. If they are lost, then that is a significant loss. Right, here is the video. Video is not entirely conclusive, as Tim White says, of what is happening. It's quite difficult to work it out. You think it's the aircraft that's actually going past at the beginning, but it's not. It's one that's already on the ground. General Staff says this is the moment they downed another of Russia's Su-25 jets. Yeah, here it is. But actually, it's already exploded down here, and then there's a huge explosion thereafter nearby. Looks like, yeah, that does to me look like aircraft. So it looks like an impact site, and then moves on, which you'd expect. And there you see a parachute landing. So yeah, that is an aircraft that's gone down. Yeah, useful for the Ukrainians to take down these aircraft. I think that, did I read that's near Avdiivka? No, or Mariinka? No, Mariinka. I think I read somewhere else that was near, but don't quote me on that. And now there was this talk previously of a Tochka U missile taking out one of the Azom metallurgical plant buildings in Bakhmut. Here is a very recent, snow and all that picture or bit of video footage of a Tochka U missile being fired by the Ukrainians, with accompanying music, which is fantastic. But more importantly, yeah, Tochka use, these are still being used. There was a theory that Ukraine had actually used all of these up, but it appears they've kept a couple back for particular objectives that they need these sizable rockets for. So that is the Tochka U. That might have been the firing of that missile at Bakhmut, at the metallurgical plant. No one really knows, but it could be that. And talking about Bakhmut, I include this bit of footage because I've seen so much footage of Russian tanks, and again over the last couple of days, tanks getting taken out because there are just 2 or 3 tanks being sent against the enemy. And of course, ATGMs will take those tanks out because they have no way of defending against people sitting in tree lines with ATGMs taking pot shots at the tanks. So it's just not how to do good warfare. It's not the use of combined arms maneuvering. So here it is, and you see the troops behind the APCs here. That looks like a YPR or an M113, so a pretty old bit of kit, and some other APC there, one of the old Soviet ones by the looks of it. Possibly not. Someone will correct me, but this is how you do it, which is, getting assistance from your troops on the ground, being able to take out different types of threat that they are more able to see, and then they can clear out the trenches while being supported by the motorized equipment. But anyway, it's that kind of thing. It doesn't look like that's training ground stuff, because if that was training ground, they wouldn't be using these old bits of equipment back in Germany or Poland or whatever. So I can't prove that that's actually going on back. I can't prove that it's just happened now, but this is just a useful time to remind people that we've seen an awful lot of footage of the Russians not doing warfare very well, and then we see very high losses, and then we see Ukrainians trying to do warfare properly and having lower losses, or at least that's those are the claims. According to the MOD, so British MOD, sorry, Defense Intelligence states that the Russians have basically failed to degrade Ukraine's unified energy system within the 2022-23 winter. It's failed. Russia has conducted long strikes since October, but large-scale attacks have become rare since early March 2023. Smaller scale strikes with fewer than 25 munitions continue, but are highly likely having much less impact on the energy system. Ukraine's network operating companies continue to source replacement transformers and other critical components. Transporting and installing these components is a major logistical challenge, especially high voltage transformers, which weigh at least 100 tons. Ukraine's energy situation will likely improve with the arrival of warmer weather. Planning and preparations for next winter have likely already begun. Some of the work these guys do in the infrastructure sort of area, that whether that be trains, whether it be energy, so on and so water, so on and so forth. These guys do an amazing job of getting these systems up and running as very soon after they've been hit. There's been provision by allies of really important bits of kit to help with that, but some of that work is heroic, brilliant stuff. Okay, so let's have a look at a few places that are being hit both now and over the last 24 hours. So Crimea, there are several explosions near the port going on of Feodosia in Crimea. Locals report 2 big explosions. So we'll see what happens in terms of that. Then on to sort of Russia on fire. This is in Rostov, Bataysk. In Rostov, another notable blaze. It's a warehouse said to house tires, and locals say it's the second such, scare quotes, accident in 2 months. Insurance or sabotage look most likely. I mean, yeah, that place going up in fire once is bad, but twice in a few months certainly looks like something else is at play. And then here we have the Voronezh Aircraft Production Association on fire. So this is certainly much more likely to be, that's looks like a fairly sizable fire going on there. This certainly looks more suspect in terms of partisan activity, so on and so forth. Okay, and then Heineken Brewery in St. Petersburg on fire as well. The reason I keep showing you these is, like, I can't remember the last time there's a fire in the UK of this kind of magnitude, any of this stuff. Yes, it happens. It's not particularly, new. Well, actually, no, it's the opposite. They do become really newsworthy because they're so rare. Now, in one day, there are 3 big fires at quite important places in Russia. 2 of them are important. One, a tire warehouse, is the second time in a month or whatever. So there is just a significant number of fires in Russia, and I keep saying this, that surely represents something. Okay, Russians are hitting with shelling, obviously, places on the front line, and with S-300 missiles still, etc., etc. This is a building in Avdiivka being hit by, I'm not quite sure, but you can see the damage in the fire. Avdiivka is being absolutely hammered at the moment, and I doubt you're going to have the fire services still operational there, and if they are, they won't be to the levels that they would be in peacetime. So yeah, I see Avdiivka going the same way as Mariinka, really. In a Horlivka direction, the Russians have shelled and launched S-300 rockets against Konstantinivka. So this is one of the supply towns, if you like, for Bakhmut. It's to the west of Bakhmut and has been just consistently hammered over the last number of months, but it seems to be an uptick recently, given that the Russians are advancing in Bakhmut. So yeah, S-300 is being used. So the usual kind of shelling and rocket attacks in the areas near to the front line in Ukraine. Right, moving on to odds and sods and other gubbins concerning military stuff in and about Ukraine. So a prosecutor in Vladimir earlier today applied for the website, so this is in Russia, of the UN to be blocked for disinformation. He was later encouraged to abandon the case because Russia is presently heading the Security Council right now. It would be rather odd if Russia banned the UN website whilst also heading the UN Security Council. Yeah, this is just another indication of the growing kind of isolationism, I think, in Russia. Instead, they're now trying to ban the forum Reddit. Reddit has, I think, over time disallowed Russian sources from being used there. I have tried to look for confirmation of these claims in the media. I haven't found anything, so do take this with a pinch of salt. Tim White also says it's being reported in Russia that police have a new suspect from Ukraine in the murder of war blogger Tatarsky. So this is Maxim Fomin, whose funeral takes place tomorrow. The guy that was blown up in St. Petersburg was apparently given a statue by Dasha Trapova. She was arrested, but Yuri Diaz sought to have handed the statue to Dasha Trapova and then flown from Moscow to Yerevan and then to Turkey. So there are so many theories going around about what happened here. The idea that if she was there, possibly she didn't know what was going on. She was an unwitting kind of. She was used, I guess, to deliver this bomb to Tatarsky, whether she knew it or not. And here it appears that this chap Yuri D, at least according to the Russians, was a guy that was behind that. Don't know, still at a position where I wouldn't cast any conclusions about what happened in that bombing and who was behind it. Just a random bit here to do with kind of ecology and Russian soldiers. It's alleged that soldiers from Russia slaughtered endangered animals in Ukraine's Kherson region just to eat. This is a reflection of their lack of food. I guess if you don't have food, then your survival comes first. So you're going to do things like this. But the shame is that these are endangered. It's an endangered species, a red book. I don't know if that's red buck. Animals from Askania Nova Reserve, so wildlife reserve, taking out endangered animals. And this is where ecosystems, where the environment is obviously hugely affected by war. This is not just a human problem. This is an environmental problem, an ecological problem, a problem with ecosystems, and it's just terribly sad as well. This is how hate is planted into the minds of young Russians, says No Reports. This is systematic indoctrination of young kids in Russia. Hate is planted in their brain at an early age. A chochol. So this is the really, a nasty way of labeling Ukrainians. A chochol is more stupid than a crow, but more cunning than a devil. Chochol is an ethnic slur. Slur was the word I was looking for. Used by Russians to make Ukrainians seem subhuman or stupid. And this is, what you see up in classrooms. Just, yeah, I absolutely despise indoctrination of children. It makes me angry and desperately sad. And this is just, you are ruining generations of children, for obviously for years to come. Right. This is well worth a read. I'm going to dip into it a little bit right now. So sometimes we hear things from Russians, from the Russian MOD saying, we shot down, or we sunk some boats here, or there was an attack on a nuclear power station. And they're often dismissed by the Ukrainians, obviously due to OPSEC. And then in the open source intelligence community, you're left going, was this Russian disinformation? Or did this actually happen? And this is Ukrainians just keeping stum about it. And you just don't know. So you kind of move on. You're like, oh, not really sure. The Russians have said this, Ukrainians said that. You make up your own mind. Well, then months later, it turns out that, yeah, something did happen. And in this case, there was an attack on a nuclear power plant by sort of special forces or Ukrainian forces across the reservoir. So you've got the north bank and the south bank of effectively Dnipro River, but this is where it's been sort of dammed, behind where it's dammed. So the Times, this is an article in Times, describes a failed Ukrainian effort to capture the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant back in October. Quote, we had speedboats, a lot of boats. We repeatedly assaulted their positions from our shore to their shore. They kept on shelling us, really heavy shelling. So let's dip into this just a little bit really quickly because I know this is a news segment. The idea, quote, the idea was this would be an infantry-only battle. They wouldn't be able to use artillery against us as this is a nuclear plant. Is this the claim? Yeah, are you sure they wouldn't? The officer said, drawn from the select units of Ukraine's military intelligence, GUR, and including the Shaman Battalion, the Kraken Regiment, and the Ukrainian Foreign Legion, even the youngest among his brothers in arms were already battle-hardened, yet none of them expected the resistance they would face at the power plant. Quote, the Russians built a very dense defense. They mined everything, the officer said. When we were approaching, they even pulled up tanks and artillery and started firing at us right on the water. So on and so forth. Goes into details. As Special Forces speedboats crossed a stretch of river nearly 3 miles wide, precision HIMARS rockets provided by the US smashed into Russian positions on the riverbank. Quote, this is our artillery and HIMARS working, says the guide describing this to the journalist, sort of pointing at the board. This is our artillery and HIMARS working. Here, they are shelling us in the water on the Dnipro River, the officer narrated as he showed the video of the assault on the Times, assault to the Times, explaining how his patrol boat had probed Russian defenses on the bank for weaknesses. Once the Ukrainian boats had neared the shoreline, the Russian guns opened up, forcing the soldiers to change directions. We had speedboats, lots of boats. We repeatedly assaulted their positions from our shore to their shore. They kept on shelling us, really heavy shelling. And you see they basically turned back, although a few of them did get onto the shore. A handful of the Ukrainians' special forces teams in smaller boats managed to make it to the shore as dawn broke, engaging the Russians in 3-hour firefight on the outskirts of the town of Nerhudar, which adjoins the plant. The main force was unable to land, however. It was impossible for such a large group to penetrate, the Special Forces officer said. With smaller groups, yes, we were advancing, penetrating, and fighting them, but with a large group, it was impossible as they were lurking everywhere. His team tried to engage the tanks on the shoreline, but it was difficult to fire anti-tank weapons while moving at speed over the water. The larger boats maneuvered to try to attack Anodhar from the opposite flank, but a constant hail of fire eventually forced all the Ukrainians to withdraw. A lot of lives were saved thanks to the commander of this operation. When he realized it would be very, very difficult and we would take heavy casualties, instead of stupidly saying go forward, he decided we could retreat. Energo Atoms, so that's a company, Kotin, said if our army can advance south towards Crimea, toward Melitopol, this is the only option. No direct shelling of the plant, no direct advance on the territory of the plant with direct actions against the Russians. It's very dangerous to do such things near nuclear material. Any damage will bring radiation to the people and to the world. So the only way to really take this as it stands, given the amount of Russian defense there, is to encircle Anodhar completely by sort of advancing in a counteroffensive down to Melitopol and so on and so forth. Okay, so I thought that was really interesting. Now going on to these leaks, there are further leaks. What's brewing could be the worst mass leak since Snowden 10 years ago. Leaked docs appear to go well beyond highly classified material on Ukraine. Increasing trove also includes sensitive briefing slides on China, Indo-Pacific, Middle Eastern terrorism. So there are new leaks, aside from the ones that I talked about yesterday. New batch of classified document appears on social media sites. This is not just Discord, where the original ones were released actually some time ago, the original ones, on Minecraft Discord, like months back. But they only really came to light over the last few days. Well, now the leak is getting greater. The scale of the leak, analysts say, is more than 100 documents may have been obtained, along with sensitivity of the documents themselves, could be hugely damaging, US officials said. A senior intelligence official called the leak, quote, a nightmare for the Five Eyes. Five Eyes is US, Britain, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, where the intelligence is there's a cooperation between those nations for intelligence. One analyst described what has emerged so far as the tip of the iceberg, but the leaked documents appear to go well beyond highly classified material on the Ukraine war plans. Security analysts who have reviewed the documents tumbling onto social media sites say the increasing trove also includes sensitive briefing slides on China, Indo-Pacific military theater, the Middle East, and terrorism. On Friday, Ukrainian officials say pro-war Russian bloggers suggested the leak was part of disinformation effort by the other side, timed to influence Ukraine's possible spring offensive to reclaim territory in the east and the south of the country. There's all sorts of theories, being thrown about. Different people. So the Russians, interestingly, some of the Russians are saying this is disinformation from Ukraine and the US. Ukraine is saying it's disinformation from Russia. And actually, you just got chaos. But my position would be this is leaked by, I don't know who, but they're obviously not fans of the US. But how did they get hold of this? It definitely seems to have come from the US because some of these, I think I've got that coming up. Yes. So behind closed doors, chagrined national security officials were trying to find a culprit. One official said it was likely that the documents did not come from Ukrainian officials because they did not have access to the specific plans, which bear the imprint of the officers of the Pentagon's Joint Staff. So this does seem to come from the Pentagon. A second official said that determining how the documents were leaked would start with identifying which officials had access to them. Jonathan Toibner, the chief executive of Filter Labs AI, which tracks messages in Russia, said that while pro-Kremlin voices were saying the leak was an American or Ukrainian disinformation campaign, the lead analyst thought it could be a Russian operation meant to sow distrust between Washington and Kyiv. The Ukraine war, Mr. Walter said, has had more document leaks than other conflicts, in part because of the role of open source intelligence and declassified intelligence, the role that's played in the war. So really interesting and very damaging for US and allies in terms of they don't want this stuff out there. This is declassified information concerning what's going on. I mean, this now affects China, the Indo-Pacific. This is way bigger than just Ukraine. So watch out for this. This I'm sure will be in the news even more as I imagine further documents will be leaked and analysed. Right. Moving on to military aid, not too much to report today. Another example of Ukrainian strategic industry being established outside the borders of Ukraine beyond Russian reach. This time, a tank maintenance depot in a cooperative venture between Geopolitical and Polish armaments concern Bumar Lebedi. So I've talked about stuff like this before. Don't know if this is the same one as I talked about before or another one, but basically together with our partners, Ukro-Boronprom, we have created a tank service center. This is predominantly for T-64s to begin with. In the long term, it is planned to extend the cooperation to support the T family tanks. The possibility of joint maintenance of the Leopard 2 family tanks is also being considered. So starting with the T tank, starting with the T-64, repairing and maybe upscaling them or upgrading them, and then looking at further T tanks before possibly Leopard 2s. Right, interesting bit of news this. The Defense Minister of Slovakia, Jaroslav Nad, said faults were found in the MiG-29s that they have given to Ukraine. They've potentially been sabotaged only in the parts where Russian workers had access to them at the Silak Air Base, or Silach, I don't know. So Russian technicians may have been intentionally sabotaging the operation of Soviet-made MiG-29 fighter jets owned by the Slovak army, said Defense Minister Jaroslav Nad. The faults may have been intentionally caused by Russian technicians, which were present or who were present at the Sliak, air base in Slovakia until last year, Nad suggested. Quote, even the police were investigating it based on our suspicions. There were parts in the engines of the aircraft that Slovak technicians accessed, and then there were parts that the Russian technicians only accessed. The defects appeared only in those parts accessed by the Russians. While the investigation did not prove intention, the Defense Ministry, quote, felt a loss of confidence in the Russian technicians at Sliak because mistakes kept appearing in places only they could get to. And this has reduced the flight life of the engines from 350 hours to 70 hours. And that is a huge problem. So, interesting sabotage there. Okay, and yeah, more sources on that and talk about that. Let's go on to geopolitics now. Despite the manipulation by the Russian state, the ruble is losing fast in value, causing Russians to storm the banks. There is no chance of the Russian economy to survive the war if it drags on and sanctions stay, says Tendar. So there's talk about the Russian ruble tanking over the last few days, and there being a rush on banks to get currency, so on and so forth. St. Petersburg residents ran to change dollars and euros amid the collapse of the ruble. The dollar is trading at 83 rubles, while the euro has reached 91 for the first time since last April. The Russian ruble has been weakening all week, but the authorities are trying to prevent panic and say that the rate will soon level off due to higher oil prices. Now, that brings me on to higher oil prices, and I didn't talk about this about 5 days ago when it happened, because I forgot. But OPEC seem to be positioning themselves with Russia and geopolitically with the kind of Russia-China axis rather than with the US. Last time this happened, the US released some of their own strategic reserves to try and offset the price rise. So basically, OPEC have said, we are not going to produce as much oil, and that benefits Russia. That basically puts money in Russia's coffers. So by doing that, you can only surmise really that this is OPEC saying, yeah, we're putting two fingers up to Russia, to the US, because we want Russia to prevail in some sense. Oil prices have surged over several of the world's largest exporters, as several of the world's largest exporters announced surprise cuts in production. Price of Brent crude is trading close to $85 a barrel after jumping by almost 6%. Economists have warned the higher oil prices could make it harder to bring down the cost of living. So this will have real effect on people. This does a number of things. So as people's cost of living goes up, they start getting more angry that money's going to Ukraine. And they start saying, hey, government, you should be worrying about our cost of living issue rather than worrying about helping Ukraine. And also, it puts money. It's the higher oil prices gives more money to the people who are buying the Russian oil. So even though it's capped, that the price of that oil is going to go up. It's going to go either up to the cap, which means that the people of the allies who are buying the oil is still paying more for the Russian oil, or outside of the cap, the people who are not adhering to the price cap on Russian oil, that oil would command even higher prices. And so Russia is a win-win for Russia on a geopolitical point and on an economic point. And it's Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and several Gulf states. You are siding with Russia here, and this is really, really annoying. So then Russia is saying to these people, "Don't worry, hey, ruble's going to level because we're going to get loads of money from oil in the next, due to higher oil prices over the next whatever." So that is, annoying. Right. So the guy this guy Bout, who was swapped with Brittany Griner in a prison swap. I wrote an article on that because I don't think people properly understood the situation, had to go at the US administration for doing that trade. In reality, they had absolutely no choice, really. If they wanted to get Griner free, that was the only thing they could do. Russia weren't going to do any other swaps. So people are saying they should have swapped this other person. If Russia said no, we're not going to do that, then you can't swap that. You can't force Russia to swap someone. So people didn't actually understand. So go and check out. I'll link my article. In fact, I'll go and find that now. So my article on Only Sky was Brittany Griner and the comparative worth of humans. It gets a little bit philosophical, but it's also just how you do prisoner swaps and like who's in the power position. And if they don't want to swap this person, you can't make them swap that person. So, just anyway, this guy Victor Bout, who's then gone back to Russia, has then been saying this, and this is just fascinating. And this is possibly the Russians just getting involved with US politics to just sow discord. It's like, say this stuff because it's going to cause right old ruckus in the US. Uh, but it's also this idea that Russia very overtly favoured Trump, and I talked about this yesterday. Anyway, this is continued stuff along those lines. So he made a statement today saying, today I sent a telegram to the former U.S. President, Mr. Donald Trump. First and foremost, I consider that his life is in danger, and that the legal process, which has now begun in New York, won't just end in Donald Trump being convicted and barred from the election. Most likely, he will simply be eliminated there. I mean, this is obviously nonsense, but this is playing into the Russian narrative. Therefore, I think it's in the interest of of humanity and primarily of the American people. I mean, this is quite grandiose talk, right? To invite Donald Trump here to Russia to give him security and protection here. So that he leads this uprising against the globalists. And now he's talking about fomenting like violence and discord, not just kind of political views, but this is like an uprising against globalists, led by Trump. So he's going to lead that uprising from Russia. He says, and most importantly, does not allow the elimination of the American people. So it's saying like all American people, if you don't want to be eliminated, Donald Trump should come to Russia. I mean, just. But anyway, it's important to know what Russia is saying. This has nothing to do with what my views about Trump are at all. This is what the Russians are saying, and it's incumbent upon me to let you know that. Right, Ukraine's PM, that's not Zelensky, that's a prime minister, will visit Canada. Now we need heavy armored vehicles, and we need more artillery shells, ammunition for howitzers and tanks. It's crucial for organisation of our counteroffensive. So he's hopeful that Canada will come to their aid. There's a few of these guys that look alike. There's him, and there's is it not Danilov, Reznikov, and I always get confused. There's three of them that look really, really like balding with beards. Yeah. Anyway, Canada has an important diaspora Ukrainian population, and that's why they are quite prominent in helping Ukrainians. Probably going beyond the size of their country, not geographically, but population wise. So yeah, there is the hope for the Ukrainians that they can get something out of Canada there. Bank of America cut short a conference. This has caused a bit of a furore online. Cut short a conference after outrage at comments on the Ukraine war. So the Bank of America cut short an online client conference on geopolitics and apologized to attendees after some balked at what they saw as pro-Russian comments about the war in Ukraine, according to those people who attended the event. 3 people who attended the event, sorry. The conference was designed as a 2-day event beginning on Tuesday, but Bank of America Securities cancelled 3 sessions addressing US sanctions on Russia and Russia-US relations. The move came after some clients complained about the tone of comments by speakers from inside and outside the bank during online forums on Tuesday. One of the bank's strategists telephoned clients after the event to apologize for the content of Tuesday's sessions, according to 3 people familiar with the matter. Quote, I still don't get why US banks still wheel out speakers at events for clients who so often roll through Moscow's talking points on the war in Ukraine. Timothy Ash, a Blue Bay Asset Management of Blue Bay Asset Management, a Russia specialist who attended the conference, wrote on Twitter. He told the Financial Times, clearly Moscow is in an information war with the West. It has an interest in influencing how Western banks portray the conflict, and banks need to be mindful of that. Goes on to say, it was more like Bank of Russia than Bank of America, said one of those present. The whole event was overwhelmingly pro-Russian. Another person described Tuesday's sessions as relentlessly anti-Ukrainian. One of those present said they felt one speaker, Nikolai Petro, a professor of political science at the University of Rhode Island, quote, said stuff that was absolutely shocking. It was straight out of the Foreign Ministry of Russia. However, Petro has countered that people who complained had their own agenda and had not really listened to what he had said, so on and so forth. So there'll be arguments from both ways there, but very really interesting that, again, one must watch the information space and who is controlling it. And that works both ways, of course. But when you are allied with Ukraine, you would want I assume the information space to be somewhat, I don't know, is that correct, siding with the Ukrainian narrative, but is that itself biased and therefore not going to the truth of the matter? These people are obviously in economics, in banking, and want to be making financial decisions that have truth at the heart rather than bias one way or the other. So, you have your own debate and make up your own mind there. But the Bank of America, should that be peddling Moscow talking points if one side of this argument is to be believed, or was this an attempt of some of these speakers to be truthful and cut through the bias? I don't know. Right. Speaking of geopolitical bias, possibly. So, No Report says here the president of Brazil offers to discuss, quote, the Crimean issue to end the war. Quote, and this is what No Report says: perhaps it makes sense to discuss Crimea. And then Zelensky cannot want everything either. We have to come to a decision, said Lula da Silva in an interview with Figaro. Did someone ask this guy? Now, the way this is reported makes it sound like that Lula says that Crimea should be like on the table for discussing, and that Zelensky should be ready to give up Crimea. But that's not actually what he said. And so you had to be really careful here. Now, is this because I'm more likely to support Lula than Bolsonaro? I'm not a Bolsonaro fan, and he was an authoritarian, terrible leader, very much like Putin, which is why he's a good mate of Putin. Lula, I don't think is such a mate of Putin, like, although they have had previous, but I think that's cooled since then. So when you start then seeing a reaction to this tweet by No Reports with a whole load of people piling in against Lula and Brazil, saying this is absolutely freaking terrible, etc., it's worth finding out what was actually said. So this Brazilian says, well, this is, then pastes in what was actually said. So Lula says Putin cannot keep the land. So Lula says Putin cannot keep the land invaded in Ukraine at breakfast with journalists. The president again defended that a group of countries negotiate peace with Russia and Ukraine. Lula said he did not agree with the Russian invasion. And this piece by a couple of Brazilian journalists. As De Silva said this Thursday, the 6th, that Russia cannot stay with the invaded territory in Ukraine, and again defended the negotiation between countries for the conflict to be ended. Russian troops invaded Ukraine in February last year, and since then fighting has continued in the region, blah, 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 blah. And it goes on to say 1 year of war in Ukraine, understand the 4 phases of the conflict. For Lula, it is necessary to bring countries together to negotiate peace with the presence of Russia, Vladimir Putin, and Ukraine, Zelensky. The president also defends that the territorial integrity of the countries must be maintained. Quote, it is not necessary to have a war. Oh, what does Putin want? Putin cannot keep the land in Ukraine. Maybe Ukraine will not be discussed, but what he invaded again will have to be rethought. Right? So there's a lot of wriggle room about what exactly he's talking about here, said Lula during coffee with journalists. Quote, Zelensky cannot have everything he thinks he wants either, which is different to what he said. Zelensky cannot want everything either. That doesn't even make sense. You can't tell someone they can't want everything. I can want the moon on a stick, right? Doesn't mean I'm going to get it, but I can want. You can't tell me what I want, right? So the actual translation, or possibly a better translation here, is that it is that where was it? Zelensky cannot have everything he thinks he wants either. Now, is this hyperrealism, or is this Russian appeasement? NATO will not be able to install itself on the border. No, it won't until, long after this has ended. So that's true. All of this is a matter that we have to put on the table. So I think this is basically more nuanced, and doing this kind of just looking at that. And I know I do this an awful lot with taking most of my sources from Twitter, but we must be careful not to misinterpret what's actually gone on here. And I really should go back to the original article itself rather than another person on Twitter arguing back there. But it's really interesting. Thanks for the full picture. Lula's quote was obviously taken out of context. People who hate Lula have jumped on this, and there have been loads of Brazilians that jumped on this, saying, "Yeah, I'm really sorry for Lula. He's terrible, and I apologize that the world has to listen to Lula." You're obviously clearly pro Bolsonaro, and that's why you're saying that. So we need to be really careful as we navigate the information space ourselves. And finally, Russian Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin has banned all government officials from leaving the country without special permission. So this is good. Russia are in a really good position, right? Talk about isolationism. They can travel abroad only on official business, is the claim there. well, they're not allowed to really fly anyway to a lot of places. So thank you. That's the end of the news today. Another long one. There's so much stuff happening on a daily basis. Really appreciate all the support you give me. Thanks for your subscriptions. Thanks for your memberships. Really appreciate everything. Take care, and I'll speak to you in the Frontline update.